What's up, everybody? We wanted to take a quick moment to remind each of you to please like, share, comment, subscribe to the podcast. Tommy,
Ring that bell.
ring the bell. It goes a long way to support the podcast. Besides that, Tommy and I offer online coaching. The links for that will be below. The link for my merch store will be below as well. And without further ado, we bring to you a Thinking Man's podcast. A Thinking Man's podcast. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of A Thinking Man's podcast. This is episode 23. This is the Jordan episode. I'm your host. My name is Joseph PIRCHER. With me, as always, my good friend Tommy Stiles. What's up, buddy? How are you?
Good, man. No complaints.
Right on. Keep on keeping on. So, today we are bringing you guys a PED protocol episode. Everyone loves to talk about drugs. Today we are going to be discussing contest prep, stack design, and considerations that go into it. So we're going to get rolling right into it. There's a couple different avenues that we can go down with this topic. So I'm going to swing it, as I always do, over to Tommy to get us rolling, and then we'll see where we go from there.
Yeah, so if you're going into a contest prep, ideally in a scenario where you would plan ahead for that, you are probably coming out of some sort of maintenance or TRT phase. I don't think it's a wise move to roll straight from an off-season blast into a prep. You've kind of set yourself up to not be at a good starting point if that's the case. So this is where proper planning of, like, nobody wakes up on a Saturday and like, I'm going to do a show in 16 weeks. Like
16 weeks out, baby.
Yeah. Plan ahead. Know what you're getting into. That way, proper preparation prevents poor performance. That's my favorite Kai Green quote. So you're going to be coming off the heels of depending on what your level of enhancement is, you might be on TRT. You might have been on nothing if you're young enough, and that's part of what you were doing. The length of the cycle is going to kind of be determined by how far out you're starting your prep. So if you're starting 20 weeks out, doesn't necessarily mean you need to start PEDs 20 weeks out, just because the prep's starting 20 weeks out. I probably wouldn't. I don't think I would start anything. Maybe depending on the client, I would increase the testosterone dose. But I don't think I would get anything really rolling until 16 weeks out. And then there's other considerations to make. Like, is this just a one-time or a one show and you're done for the year? Or are you going to keep rolling into other shows? Is there a national level show that you're doing further down the line? Like, all that needs to be considered when you're mapping things out. Getting into a 40-week blast is where you're going to start to see, things could go wrong.
That's where things get spicy, baby.
Fatigue can build up, inflammation can build up. That's a long ass time to be on PEDs. It is fun to someone who hasn't done it, but it does wear you out. So I think the biggest consideration I want to make first is time management and knowing how your year is structured. And if you're working with a coach who's doing that for you, which that should be the case in my opinion, then you're not going to have to worry about like when things are starting, when things are ending. You're going to know what the next phase looks like based off the current phase you're in.
Yeah, that framework should absolutely be in place well ahead of time. Really, I've talked about this, started pumping out the TikTok content here, but I've talked about this on there but Mark Hector went on Fuad's podcast and talked about how a big part of his success in this off season, where it's like he's going to be up 20 plus pounds of stage weight. His coach Callum just works everything backwards. And that's exactly how I do things. We do things at J3U. I know that's how you do things with your clients too. And that should be basically the first pillar of how you're going to design anything, is working from the goal and then reverse engineering it backwards. So, yeah, all those phases should be set up. I agree that there should be like a pre-prep maintenance phase where you're kind of gradually cleaning things up, body weight is coming down, just slowly, like maybe just below maintenance. Training volume is at like a maintenance lower end level. And then as you ramp back in with PEDs, the volumes can go up a little bit. And, that's when you'll start to see some changes. As far as the timeline, it really is going to depend on where you're getting someone and how long you've had someone. If you've been able to kind of structure an entire off season for that person, and their blood work and all their health markers were in an awesome spot, even at peak dosage. I have a couple guys that are like this. I'm like this, where even at peak PED loads, my blood work looks great. So, just talking, let's say, in my specific example, my blood work and health markers remain excellent even when I'm at peak dosage. And this pertains to what I'm actually doing in real life. So I'll go through another push phase where we reach like a peak level of PEDs here over the winter. And then February and March, I'll have like an 8-week maintenance phase. And then 24 weeks out from North Americans is when I'll start to escalate things as far as PEDs. But knowing, like Tommy said, knowing how long that timeline is, that's a long timeline to be on. The escalations are very slow and very modest. So it's a small bump each time, and then there's a good amount of time in between each bump. So that doesn't mean if you hear this, that's just a rite of passage to blast for 24 weeks before a show. It should be based on your individual circumstance and like what the goal is, what the timeline is. But ideally, yeah, you'd want to keep, especially for someone, maybe the first couple preps that they've done, the first couple of times they've been enhanced through a prep. Yeah, I think even anywhere from 12 to 16 weeks is a good launch pad of being on going into the show. And then one other thing to touch on, because you had mentioned like maybe it's their first exposure to PEDs going into the prep. I know you're throwing that out as an example. For everybody listening, though, I'm not sure that that's when I would time my first cycle. I think I would probably want to be growing and in a pretty handsome surplus, even if it means some additional body fat, because you just want to get as much as you can. Everyone that's ever used PEDs will tell you the first time that they used them was probably the most significant stretch of progress that we almost strive to create every time thereafter. So I think it would probably be better set up if you could grow during that first cycle, but things don't always work out like that. So if you wind up using a first cycle to go into a prep, I think 12 weeks would be more than enough.
Yeah. That'll probably be a scenario where you're growing into the show, because
it might be the only one.
Your first exposure.
It might be the only time, unless you come from the genetic family that Kevin Levrone does. That might be really the only time where you really, because you'll see the composition changes from being in a deficit, but then the turned up anabolic load that somebody's under, they're gonna grow. For the first time, they're gonna grow.
Oh, yeah.
So talking through it, actually, it might not be a bad idea. You might get some wacky results, but there's going to be a ceiling on it because you're not in that surplus just mashing the gas on it.
Yeah. I mean, all rules to traditional contest prep would kind of be obsolete when you have that anabolic environment for the first time.
Yeah.
It's like you're going to probably be gaining weight and getting better for a while.
I was going to say too, that's a scenario where you could probably push a pretty aggressive deficit because your recovery capacity is going to be so beyond where you've ever been. And especially if this is someone that, hopefully is controlling some of the other variables, just general sleep and stress. Yeah. I mean, you could probably get them pretty damn lean pretty quickly and have them like putting on tissue and seeing gym performance go up too. So yeah, that might be an interesting little science experiment, actually.
Yeah. So I think we've got our time frame.
Specific compounds or?
Yeah. So if we're gonna testosterone is going to be our base. Now, everyone's going to respond differently to testosterone based off how you're going to aromatize. Like, perfect example, you and you're a high aromatizer. I am not. I can handle a lot of testosterone with no issues.
Yeah.
So that's information that needs to be known between you and your coach that's going to kind of dictate how high you're going to be able to take that test dose up before you need to add in that second compound, which if it's a DHT derivative, Masteron or Primo, I personally like Primobolin, not a big fan of Masteron. I think it has its place in the later stages of prep, and you could sub Primo out for Masteron. But for me, in off season and the early part of prep, I like Primo, and then maybe 8 to 10 weeks out, switch to Masteron. I just think for Masteron has a more, for me, I've noticed it can crush my estrogen more than like a Primobolin. So
that's a good reason to make that switch then. That makes sense.
Yeah. So saving it, knowing that for the later stages of prep, because it's a cutting drug. Remember, it's a cutting drug. Just lines things up for me. So you've got your test base, doses are all arbitrary. I'm not going to tell anybody what kind of numbers to take. That's going to be predetermined information. There's no black and white. I'm not going to tell you to take 500s. Your second compound, which for me, the way I work personally and with clients, is going to be a Masteron or a Primo. And then depending on how far out you're starting that cycle and where you're coming from, you could add in a little bit of Deca. I did that with a client this year, and we pulled it 12 weeks out. But it's just dependent on the client's exposure, where you're at, what you need.
Can you give us some of that context? Was this somebody like pretty advanced, and then what was the outcome of it?
It was, so we came out of it, it was 8 weeks of pure TRT, like 200 milligrams. With this individual, we didn't need to pull food down at all. He's a pure ectomorph, very similar to me. He's just going to lose the pop and the fullness from being off PEDs. No GH was in play, but still held great composition, just lost that pop. So going back,
somebody that stayed like pretty like dry and lean too, like as far as like any type of estrogenic side effects.
Not really a huge aromatizer. And never really pushed aggressively. So we actually kept the off season very moderate. I don't know that we might have got above, like right above a gram for only 4 weeks of it. And then that was when we went into TRT. So the off season was very,
it's pretty modest
to say the least. Yeah. We escalated up from a half gram for a whole off season to like 1.1 grams.
And is this a pretty big guy? Like what does he got as dimensions here? What are we talking about?
Stage weight, he'll probably be 200 to 203. So
okay, so that's a good chunk of muscle.
A 215-pound male in the off season.
Which sounds appropriate. I feel like, again, like we don't want to talk specific dosages, but just hearing all that, I feel like all that lines up to, like, you're giving people a good framework to work within as to why this scenario specifically made sense.
So it was test Primo Deca to start the prep cycle. And the Deca was just because I wanted to actually increase water retention, because I know how quickly he can drop. And I wanted to bolster strength. I wanted to get, his training in a really good spot before the later stages of prep. And that was the reasoning for it. A little joint protection.
Absolutely.
So where am I at? That's kind of how I'd start the first half of prep. I consider the actual fat loss part of prep 12 weeks and on. You obviously can burn fat outside of that, and you are, but I'm not actually thinking of pushing for aggressive fat loss, at least with this individual, until 12 weeks.
That
Now,
makes
if you
sense. And
have
that's
somebody,
going to be super person dependent though, too. Like
hugely,
I'll
yeah.
prep for 24 weeks, and even being in a decent starting spot, I'll prep for 24 weeks, and I need each one of them. Like I'll do a qualifying show at 21 weeks out, and I'm not going to be as sharp as I will be 3 weeks later. So it's totally just person dependent. For me, it needs to be, and a lot of people, like you mentioned, I think these people that are just maybe a little bit more uh watery and kind of fat retentive.
Yeah.
uh those people just need more time. You know what I mean? Those are typically, I'm somewhat of a rare case because I'm taller for bodybuilding, but then I still have that type of response. Typically, those are the guys that are like 5'6" and below, where it's like they have no problem putting on muscle, but man, it takes forever to get them ready. And you might need 20 or 24 weeks.
Yeah, I think it just depends on it also depends on the starting point, like you said. Like, are you
Yeah.
someone who's starting like 30 pounds over your contest weight?
Right.
With this individual, I think he's actually going to end up only losing like 7 or 8 pounds this prep when it's all said and done. And
Wow.
that's
Yeah.
that's a big testament to
That's well done.
how modest we kept things in the offseason gear wise. So he actually is getting a little bit of growth into the show with what we're doing right now. And it's not like
Yeah.
anything's aggressive, but when you stay that low in the off season and then, 1.5 grams of contest drugs, you're gonna
Right.
get you're gonna add some muscle where it's not something I accounted for, but it's just something I've seen getting
Yeah.
harder and the scale's not going down. And it's like he's already below weight, so it's not an issue.
Right.
Um,
Okay.
so it's just, we'll keep saying this whole podcast, but it's so individual and there's so many different variances.
Yeah.
Just trying to give you guys like the framework basically of how to think about it, or how it would be laid out to you by your coach.
Yeah.
So do you want to add anything onto that? I mean, basically, like,
Yeah, no, same thought
go ahead.
process where it's like just these different families of compounds. So it's like same deal. Like we use like this kind of risk mitigation, the black model, however you want to say it. That's kind of the general framework, and then a lot of the additional kind of advanced stuff is stuff that I had learned from John and through J3 University. So we look at things like you said, same deal. Testosterone as a base. What can you handle without an aromatase inhibitor? That's going to be person dependent. Then compound number 2 is always going to be a DHT derivative. Um, for us and for me, just in my own experience, both as a bodybuilder and when coaching people, it's affordability, availability first. Just making that call. The on paper, the two compounds of Primo and Masteron are very, very similar, almost identical. I've heard some people say, which is true. But then you also need to have like that personal experience to know, like Tommy does, where Masteron just modulates his estrogen too much to the point where it's a negative now. And it's almost like he's taking aromatase inhibitor. So it's like, okay, then just use the other one if it doesn't respond that way. But typically, if we don't know that something like that is lasting, and I don't know for sure, like verified by some type of third party testing or lab testing, that person's Primo that they have access to is on the money. Just as a general rule, I lean towards Masteron because it's usually not going to be faked and it's more affordable. And a lot of times you're almost, as a coach, you're playing like moderator with your client, trying to fit everything into the budget on top of them, paying you throughout. So,
Right.
but same exact thought process generally. And then the 19 Nors, like Nandrolone, Trenbolone, we're a little more conservative with those. Those are very situation dependent. There are situations. I think the way that you deployed it with the person that you explained is an excellent example of it. I have a shorter kind of pre-prep push phase. So because of that, I'm going to be using some Nandrolone alongside the Masteron that I use because it's situation dependent. It's someone that their blood work looks great even on, and I have a shorter time to kind of put on additional muscle before starting the prep. So at that point, you're going to throw additional resources at it. I'm talking it would be a small amount. So, if I were to use an NPP, that would probably what I went with as far as Nandrolone, especially if like we're talking about the beginning stages of a contest prep, you want it to be in and out a little bit quicker. So I would use NPP or recommend it. And it would really only be at something like 20 milligrams. I'd probably start, depending on where the person is in their journey, at 10 milligrams a day. So 70 for the week. And then if it's someone that's more advanced, then we already have the DHT derivative at a pretty handsome dose. It might move up to 20 a day, so 140 for a week. That will be the dose that I stick at this next time using it. And then, like you said, the rest of what we're going to talk about should be situation dependent for the end of prep, when you're starting to see these diet adaptations. Fatigue is at a really high level. Training performance, so much so that maybe training performance is starting to take a dip. I think as a general rule, somewhere like 6 to 8 weeks out from the main show, you would employ or deploy. It's tough. I don't want to say this and then like all the bros go and let it fly, but Trenbolone for someone that's like at like a state and above level, I think it's way overused and used too early, but starting at 6 to 8 weeks out for someone that's like a pretty good, pretty solid intermediate to advanced competitor, same consideration. I'd probably put in 10 milligrams at maybe 8 weeks out, 10 milligrams a day of Tren. Because you use too much. I feel like the industry standard is like 300 or 350. And man, that feels like I've done that. That's always been what I've done. That's always been what I've started at. And it feels like you're kind of just jumping into the deep end, because that is going to be, all the benefits are going to come at that dose, of course. But then that seems to be right at the point where you're immediately going to have to start considering the negatives as well. Sleep starts to go to shit. And for the people that are self-aware, they typically report that their mental health in one direction or another has taken a turn for the worse because of it. Whether it's aggression, lack of patience, lack of empathy, whatever it is, I think we've all experienced this. Now, if you are more conservative with your dosing, 10 milligrams a day for the first couple of weeks, eventually moving to 20 milligrams a day for 140 a week, that seems to be like a really good sweet spot where you get all the benefits that you would hoped. It looks like you start to get drier, whatever that means as you get leaner, but it upholds training performance. And then also Tren has been shown to kind of, in layman's terms, power your CNS through fatigue. You're less susceptible to fatigue when you're on it. So I think that dosage is a good one. And there's not, other than the very, very high ends of like national and pro level bodybuilding, I wouldn't really ever consider putting on somebody more, because then, like I said, you start to run into a lot of those really nasty side effects.
Yeah, Tren is it's an interesting one. I like the timeline. I think it just depends on the individual.
Yeah.
I've gone as far out as 10 weeks adding it in with a client, and then I've done as far out as 12, which was probably not needed, but
how do you respond to it individually? You're a pretty even keeled guy, so I feel like maybe you aren't someone that isn't. I'm just guessing, but I have to feel like you aren't dealing with those mental sides the way that some people do.
So Nandrolone in general, like Deca, also gives me total lack of empathy. Like I don't care about anything.
Interesting.
That's also part of my disposition though. And like,
sure,
I've been breeding myself not to react emotionally to anything for the last 5 years. So I'm also creating this environment with or without these compounds. Tren, I will say, 5 years ago when I took it, I had the ability to snap in my head quickly, and that was alarming because it was like I never didn't have that control. Now I can have those moments in my head, but they don't ever get outwardly expressed.
Yeah.
just a little quicker to react. It's nothing I can't handle. It's something I'm very self-aware of, but I don't get like the anxious feeling. I don't the night sweats I get. I don't get crazy sleep disturbances because it's not really any different than my norm. So I think it's important to, there's a lot of these, we talk about ashwagandha and different stress support formulas. I think having something like that on hand and in play with some of these drugs is very important. Because remember, contest prep, training is a stress, dieting is a stress, cardio is a stress,
the deficit, all of
everything about prep is a stress. These compounds are a stress. Like you need to be doing something to support or stress support. And I just think there's a lot of good companies. I'm not going to, plug anything, that are putting out good products that do help. Because the last thing you want is just like your cortisol to be through the roof. You're not going to progress that way down the stretch. In the last 4 weeks, I see people, they look great 4 weeks out, and I just watch it unfold. And that's because the mind isn't ready to go there. So,
and these drugs don't help, especially if they're not programmed accurately. You know what I mean? Like you take someone that is struggling, especially as you enter that like low, maybe new low body fat level that someone hasn't reached yet. And then you're also trying to make them navigate being on 350 milligrams of tren, and it's like this is a recipe for disaster a lot of the time.
Yeah, no, I mean it depends on the individual. I've gone as high as
I was just gonna ask you, what's your highest?
400
with the golden goddess. 400. Okay.
Yeah.
I did 600 my first ever prep, like a fucking idiot. So if anyone is listening to this, anyone at all, don't ever do some stupid shit like that. I was a maniac. I was an idiot. I was an erratic, emotional maniac. Like you said, that was the first time. I've always been a pretty laid back dude, like socially, and I wear my heart on my sleeve, but I'm also very, very even keel for the most part. As far as like I'm excitable, but not in terms of anger or like snapping on people. And man, that I'll tell you what, that first cycle taking that much tren, it was like I was just a different person. I mean, I'd imagine anyone that knew me and was in my life at that time could see a pretty significant shift over a couple week period of being on that. So it just depends on how you respond individually to it.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely like with someone, I'll start lower dose with people and then escalate as needed.
Yeah.
So if I do start further out, it's a very, very small amount.
It's lower. Yeah. Now, how long were you at that peak, that 400? Was that a time that you started like closer to the show? So it was a shorter duration, or?
No, that was actually in the off season.
Okay.
I think my peak for contest prep is like 350.
Okay, yeah, so 50 a day.
50 a day.
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty standard. And for you, man, we've talked PEDs so much, especially just on this show. I feel like you're really resilient to gear, just generally. Like you don't get a lot of the negative side effects that a lot of people get. So maybe you're someone that can handle some of these higher dosages. And you've also been training in bodybuilding for fucking 15 years. So it's like, again, people listening to this, like, no, don't just go and take Tommy's personal experience and say, oh, this is a benchmark for where I can get to. Like, no, chances are you're not going to have that type of response. You don't have the type of muscle that Tommy has, and you don't have as much skin in the game as Tommy does. So those are all things to consider.
So, I mean, getting even deeper, I think we've talked about this off the air. Like, your family history plays a role. Like, I do have a lineage of alcoholism in my family line. Like, nobody's died from like my family is resilient. Like, as far as that,
those resilient genes. Yeah,
I think I'm built to handle toxic amounts of things that others might not be able to. So my blood work, I always get it done. And this is a testament to Dante and Dusty making me do this, but I always get it done within 7 days of post show. So I want to see it at its absolute worst. And I've never really seen anything like, yeah, there's markers that are high, but they're supposed to be high a week post show, considering what I just did.
Right. Right.
So I see the damage that I did, and then it's, you readjust your supplement design, and maybe, and then it comes down to, was that risk something I'm willing to do? Was it worth it, type thing? And then you just go from
But
there.
then going immediately after the show, though, you get an idea of what it is at its absolute worst. You think back to what it is that you were using, and it's like, okay, that cocktail of stuff that I was using was, I used it for 3 weeks, let's say. It's like, okay, I was probably walking around with my blood work looking like that for 3 weeks. That's the level of risk that I'm willing to take on. But then the benefit also of going right away post show and getting those bloods is if you go 4, 6, 8 weeks after, you see how quick these markers are to bounce back and how resilient you really are to whatever it is that you just, subjected yourself to. So that's a takeaway in itself. I think that I just put out a short YouTube answer on my own YouTube. Someone had asked me how quickly after a show should I go and get blood work? And I think you just laid it out for them. It should be as quickly as you can after the show. And then again, 6 or 8 weeks later. We have this horrible habit in bodybuilding where we want everything to look as sparkly as it can before we actually go take a look at it. And it's like, okay, yeah, 8 weeks post show, everything better look damn good.
Right.
And then it's like, that's a green light to go back on. It's like, dude, you might be spending the next 20 weeks with some awful looking blood work because you don't know what it is at its worst. So those are all good things to definitely consider.
Yeah. So, the timeline for like the Masteron and the Tren is anywhere from 6 to 8, maybe with someone more advanced, 10. It just depends. And then as far as like orals, I'm not a big fan of them, honestly. I personally, and this can be, maybe it's just something I've noticed, I personally see and feel changes to myself when I have Winstrol in play. I feel harder and I look harder. Like after a week of Winstrol, I can tell a change in my look. It's the drier look. So, I mean, Winstrol does have diuretic properties, so it does back up literature wise. Like that's what I see with my eyes, and I definitely feel it in my joints for sure. So that's the thing about bodybuilding and contest prep is like, if you feel pretty shitty, your training performance is like you're having to really focus and work to keep it where it is. Chances are you look pretty good. If you don't feel shitty, 9 times out of 10 you probably don't look good or you're behind. As that preps, and I'm not talking about suffering. I'm just saying like it should be
uncomfortable.
It should require much more mental effort and physical effort to do the things that you were doing in the off season and earlier in prep. As it goes on, yeah, you're much more uncomfortable. But in bodybuilding, the exterior look is going to be improving if that's the internal case. So for me, like, yeah, Winstrol makes me look a lot better, but my pressing strength takes a huge nosedive as soon as that drug's in play, and it's a necessary evil at that time. So over the years, I've had to get smarter about how I go about my training when it comes to pressing movements, just because I know that no matter what I do, it's going to take a hit. But that being said, like I think Winstrol anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks out, same timeline as the other two we mentioned. And for me, I don't know. I've 50 is my staple, 50 milligrams a day. I did go up to, and I don't advise this, I did this on my own, no one told me to. I went up to 100 milligrams a day for 3 weeks in between shows last year. Again, it was just part of that, like, fuck it, I need to be harder and drier look. My mind wasn't obviously optimal. Live and learn. So I don't think I got anything.
Yeah. I've gone up to 100 as well, and that was when I really felt the that dryness, like to where it's negatively affecting training. I was pretty resilient to 50. I do agree it feels like you're harder because, and typically if you're doing things the right way, yeah, like there's a lot of other drugs in play. You're dieting, you're doing cardio, all these things. Um, but once something like Winstrol gets added in, it should be the only variable that's changing. So then within a week or two, that difference, it's a, you know, you can't be so sure, but there's a pretty good chance that any new changes that were made were helped by whatever that new addition was. So I'm with you. I have seen that same result, but at this point, and I've tried it all, man. I've done up to 100 milligrams of Winstrol, anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks out. 100 milligrams of Anavar a day. I've done a combination of those two at some point. We will probably talk about running Halo. I feel like a staple within the bodybuilding industry at something like 2 or 3 weeks out, which will improve stability and training performance, but at a hell of a cost. That's one of the more toxic drugs that we're going to expose ourselves to. So much so, I'm, looking back at things in hindsight and knowing what I know now, moving forward, I would probably only recommend or use myself Anavar in the later stages of prep. And that's going to be guided strictly by training performance. If you're starting to feel like shaky and lack of stability on movements and shit, and then your training is kind of in the tubes, Anavar will come along and really help that. And then dosing too will be kind of dependent on the size of the person and how far into their journey is. I think 20 milligrams starting for males is a good benefit, maybe up to 40, something like that. And, going back to like affordability, reliability, whatever, a lot of these hormone clinics, and I know the one that I'm affiliated with, a lot of them are making Anavar now. Now they're expensive. But for me, and I would say for any of the ladies listening that will be using Anavar at any point, the cost is worth it to know for sure this is what this is. I've always thought about that, like where I wasn't going to spare any cost in prep, because it's like, man, I've put everything into this. Like I need to make sure everything's on the money. If it's more expensive, to have the peace of mind knowing it's on the money and that I'm getting what I should be, is great. And then ladies, it should be even a step further where we're going to make sure that it's not a different male sex hormone that's going to bring in unexpected adverse effects. So it is expensive, but I think it's worth it. And then knowing that you're getting like real clinical Anavar, it doesn't take a whole lot. And you're going to see an awesome benefit. So I think those are all things to consider. I wanted to go back and get your opinion though on one. Have you ever run like the two alongside each other, Anavar and Winstrol? And if so, what was that like for you? Because that was a good blend for me, because it kind of brought that dryness, but then also the Anavar helps with training for performance. Like I said, the Winstrol alone, I never really felt like I got much training wise. I felt like it was mostly visual. And then I'd also want to hear your experience and opinion on Halo, because that's everybody's favorite.
Yeah, so I agree. I've never noticed performance enhancements with Winstrol. It's all visual and an internal feeling. If anything, performance takes a negative hit.
Right, from the joints. Yeah.
So I've never run Anavar in prep, only in the off season, which that was
interesting.
I don't advise that now. This is like 4 years ago. I think it was a waste. It's unnecessary toxicity in an environment where if food's high and you're doing everything else, there's just better ways. It was just at a time where like what we're talking about now wasn't being talked about or used. So, it was test EQ and an oral was an off season. At least that's what mine was.
Yeah. And a lot of times you're lucky if it was only that. A lot of times it was like one compound, one injectable from each of these families that we've discussed, plus an oral, where it's fucking test, primo, and Deca plus an oral. And it's like, I wonder, I can barely get my food down. I wonder why.
Yeah. But I think, like you said earlier too, like Primobolan is a fantastic compound sourcing and affordability those are two huge things
A
people need to
nightmare.
consider. And like I said,
Yeah.
4 years ago, trying to find Primobolan for where I was at just wasn't a thing.
Right.
So my only experience with Anavar is in the off season. That being said, people are very disrespectful of how powerful Anavar is. Like my lipid
I
panel takes
agree.
takes a big hit from Anavar alone. I know
Yeah.
that. I've
Yeah.
gotten the blood work. And that was on 40 milligrams.
Right.
So
And
40 is
most
the
guys are
absolute
running 100. Most guys are running 100 milligrams
40
alongside
is
other shit. So it's like, imagine what most of these guys, what their blood work would look like at peak stress. I'm sure, like especially ALT, AST, ALP, all these liver enzymes, I'm sure are
H
through the roof. And like you said,
HDL.
the lipids are wrecked. Yeah.
Yeah. HDL is getting closer to fucking 10 than it is going
0.
up.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so that's my experience with Anavar. Love it. Like you said, I think it's a great tool to have in the bag and prep when you need to give training performance a boost. You're not going to be able to, because you're in a contest prep. You can't add more food. We're
Right.
getting ready for the stage. We're low body fat. Performance is the number one driver to muscle retention and, in my opinion, fat loss. You're not having to slave away at your cardio and your daily movement if you're able to still maintain as close to the same level of training performance as you started prep with. Anavar can be a tool, but a little bit goes a long way. Like I said, most I'll ever do is 40. I know I don't need more than that. 40 gave me aggression in the gym that like other even Trend doesn't do. Like nothing does what
Yeah.
Anavar did for me personally. So I like to go off what I've experienced for myself. What do I know? I know Anavar makes me feel like I can lift a house. I don't get appetite issues. There's
Right.
no lower back pumps.
Yeah.
So Anavar is a good prep tool if needed. Some people can maintain training performance without it. And then why induce the toxicity if you don't need it?
That's
So
a
that's
good
a
point.
good
And the
point.
cost, because it's going to cost you to get the real thing.
Exactly. Don't we have all these tools, but I'm not just gonna, I don't give someone like, here's your prep cycle 20 weeks out. We're gonna do everything along this timeline. Like if I don't have to use Anavar with someone, I won't. As far as males, females, I think most of them end up using it at some point or
That's going to be
another.
a main tool. Yeah.
Not all, but some. So if you don't need it, if your training performance doesn't take a hit, I wouldn't add it in. And then Halo, I've used it, 2 to 3 weeks out, as high as 30 milligrams a day.
Yeah. And what are you getting from it? So you mentioned like the aggression and everything from Anavar. Anything similar? Anything to report back on Halo? No?
I've never pinpointed anything. Like I don't.
Interesting. There's
I've
a lot
heard
of people
guys
that say that. I hear a lot of people that I'm like, I'm already on a lot of shit. I don't know what this is really doing.
I hear that strength is through the roof. I've never felt that. Like
Yeah.
nothing about me is strong 2 weeks out.
Yeah. My first experience with it, I think I probably romanticized the drug like in its entirety because of my first experience with it. I was experiencing some pretty drastic drop off in my training performance, and paid a good price for what I thought was like a higher end product. And man, it worked. I put it in at 3 weeks out, and I was literally doing weights that I hadn't touched until or since like 10 or 12 weeks out, like all of a sudden over the course of a week. Now, could that be mental or placebo? It could be, but also I'd noticed like a certain level of aggression as well. Now, all these other drugs are in play, who knows? But I definitely noticed training performance, but also, like I mentioned, stability. I lose my stability because it's not a strong point for me, just naturally around my shoulder girdles, like my upper body stability takes a hit. So that at the time was a good boost. Now, John ran kind of a case study for the bodybuilding world last year where he prepped, I think, peaked for 4 or 5 different shows and ran a different oral individually each time. And his blood work was the worst on Halo and on Superdrol. So just seeing that, I think most people in the bodybuilding industry would have known that would be the case just as a guess ahead of time. But seeing it and seeing the way that it was, it's like, man, this probably isn't worth it. If you can't exactly pinpoint what's coming in return for using it. So, yeah. And I think just as a general point, you made such a good point that I think in prep, you had talked through earlier, like, maybe using less. That way you have more in the bag to use in prep as opposed to off season. I hear that, and there's a million ways to skin a cat. I'm sure there will be clients this year that I put through something similar like that. But also there's times where in the off season, if you're trying to put new muscle tissue on, I think that's almost harder than trying to retain muscle.
100%.
So there's times where I think for me personally, my peak dosages are going to be highest like now, like off season, pushing for new tissue. And then once you have that, and especially if you can uphold training performance, I just feel like a lot of guys wind up looking their best, like their actual stage look, like looking hard and dry, but like fresh and like lively and healthy when the dosages are less. A lot of the times you see guys that are like mega dosing shit, they come in and they're like super inflamed and watery looking. And this is when you see guys that have bad acne and just bad skin texture. Bad skin texture, I almost never hear this discussed in bodybuilding. It will ruin your stage look. Like if you're using so much of anything that your skin is screaming at you like that, it's not going to be good when you're all oiled up and tanned. Like it's not going to look pretty. So really the thought, like you said, it's not like, hey, here's all these fun tools and let's just pick and choose from each of them. It's like, no, you should really have a rationale for each piece of this puzzle that you put together. And you should be trying to get away with as little as possible because your look will be better the less overall oxidative stress that you impose on your body.
Yeah, agreed.
Now it depends. I will say too, as a general statement, that was just a general thought. There are always going to be different circumstances. Context is king, like Tommy loves to say. If there are periods where you're intentionally pushing like a really hard deficit, if somebody's behind or, you're just pushing output a ton or whatever the case is, you're trying to keep training volume higher than you normally would because it's a weaker body part and you're trying to maintain it there. Those are all times where, yeah, there might be escalations to help fuel that. But I think just generally, I do think like, especially at the very end of contest prep, like you're almost there. You blasting drugs at 3 weeks out isn't all of a sudden putting muscle back on you or growing you. Like you just need to bring in a clean, tight look with what you have. So I think that should be part of the thinking.
Yeah, no, you're not making up for what's not there by adding milligrams down the stretch. And I'm sure you and I have both been caught in that vortex.
I've done it.
Yeah.
I've done it. It doesn't work, but I've done it.
This is what's like younger listeners can take it from us. Like we're so rational right now, but like at one point we had the irrational thoughts, and that's what was able to get us to a place of like, all right, hindsight's 2020, right? I can look back at the things I was doing at the tail end of my prep last year, like that was all stupid. I would never tell a client to do that. Why did I do it? But you're in the moment.
You live and learn. Dude. You can the only way that you can get on this podcast and give people that experience and say, hey, don't do this, is by doing it and doing it yourself. Don't take 600 milligrams of Tren. I know this for sure. Don't do this. The only reason I know that is because I did it.
Exactly. Everybody in the industry I've ever, at least who's come out and said what they've done and said they took high dose Tren, every one of them is now saying, don't do it. It's stupid. It does nothing.
Dude, you know James just came out. James Hollingshead is carrying more muscle than almost anybody on planet Earth when you think about it. There's like a select group of maybe 20 dudes that have more muscle on planet Earth than James. He's peeled right now, posting photos at like 280. He said on Fouad's podcast, he is using less than he ever has before, including Tren. He's using 20 milligrams a day of Tren is what he said. Not using that as like a plug for my own protocol, but that was just the truth. That's what he said. And it's, I think, his best look. And he said that it's his best mental state that he's ever been in this deep into a prep. So, like I was saying, as far as maintaining muscle, I mean, we're talking about the peak of muscularity retention, and he's doing that on that low of a dose. Like, this is not a 170-pound men's physique competitor saying, "Oh, I'm holding my tissue on 140 milligrams of tren." No, this is like one of the biggest dudes planet Earth has to offer, and he's like, "I'm bringing maybe my best look ever on this amount." So I think it just goes to show you that good training and accurately managing fatigue and all these other variables should come before, like, hey, this is the amount of milligrams I'm going to use.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you got to think about where he's at. We're talking. You made a good point about putting on new tissue versus retaining tissue. It takes less milligrams to retain. I think you made it, like, because I'm in that camp too. Like, I'm currently using much more than I probably would need to retain, because I'm trying to grow into a whole new class.
Yeah.
And the example I gave, like, that was the case this year. Next year won't be that case. Because he needs to grow coming out of prep. A lot of different individual variances. I think when you get to a point where you're at a maxed out size limit, or you've hit your weight cap, if you're in classic or a certain bodybuilding division, then yeah, your off seasons probably could be pretty bleak, and you might not even need anything other than your TRT. But I'm not there, so I can't speak on that.
Yeah, neither of us.
Where are you at with so I think we can touch on GH and then the fat burners.
Yeah, so growth hormone, we've talked about that in depth alone on a separate podcast. But in that phase, in a fat loss phase, I think if you're only going to do one dose of growth hormone, let's say it's 2 units, it should be first and foremost in a fasted state where you go and do your cardio for the day following that. That is the one time where I think it truly makes sense, and there is a tangible benefit to doing cardio specifically fasted as opposed to fed. And then from there, I'd actually work backwards in the day if you have additional doses. So I'm always going to keep a growth hormone dose at 2 units. First, we're going to have one fasted before cardio. That growth hormone is going to liberate fatty acids into our bloodstream for us to go and kind of burn up as fuel during that fasted cardio. If I have a second dose, it's going to be before bed. Bioavailability is highest before bed, and it's going to improve recovery across multiple fronts, including connective tissue, sleep, all these things. So I think that makes sense. And unless we're talking about someone, even I would say probably starting at your size and up, that is where the minimum threshold would be for someone to consider like 6 units of growth in a prep. Otherwise, if you don't have that level of muscularity, you're just going to add additional water from that aldosterone response that then you have to try to manage, and you have to then you're forcing your coach to kind of see through the water and really like strain to get an accurate idea of where actual body fat is as opposed to the water. So I think for anyone really from like maybe set, like we've talked about, I think it makes sense to get growth hormone in the mix earlier than people were when we were coming up. That was almost like, you reserved a right to the privilege of using growth hormone. It felt like it was like, oh, you better get as far as you can without it before using it when we were coming up. Now I think it makes sense both from a results and long-term health and longevity perspective to get it into the mix sooner, because everything else will go further. And I think that also rings true in a fat loss phase or in a contest prep. I would say even if you can only afford one season or the other, it makes more sense to have it in during contest prep. And then we'll touch on the fat burns, but or the fat burners and thyroid after. But what's your perspective on growth, both like for yourself and for clients?
So yeah, I mean, Biggest fact, like you said about being a moderator, it's what's your budget? Can you add this in without adding stress to your prep because of finances? If the answer is not yes, then I'm not even bringing it up. We're just going to prep without it. Growth hormone isn't a necessity. Does it help? Absolutely. We did a whole fucking podcast on it. But first and foremost, I have to know what your budget is, and is your budget going to become a stressor because of trying to afford this? If I concretely know that, and that's a discussion that already happened, or you're already using it coming into the prep, I think, like you said, I've never prepped on more than 4 IUs with GH.
There you go.
That being said, like up until whatever I said in that podcast, I've really never done more than 4. I took myself to 6 on my own, like another stupid move because the timing didn't matter, but 4 was my staple for years. I never stopped. Females, I think 2 IUs for your prep is plenty. It's fine. You'll get the lipolysis effects from it. It's a good fasted tool. I think the decision of where to pull growth hormone out as the prep is dwindling down is person dependent.
So let's talk through that. Actually, that's a good question or a good topic, and I don't know that we discussed that when we addressed growth hormone at large.
I don't think we did.
So let's dive into that. Actually, let's use yourself as an example first, like in your own scenario. Does it at any point make sense for you to pull the growth, and if so, at what point? And then we'll talk through other scenarios about when it might differ in time.
So I never did in my prep in 2017.
You weren't using it then, right?
I was, yeah.
Oh, you were. Okay.
I didn't pull it at all.
Oh, you didn't pull it. Okay.
So I don't have enough anecdotal on myself to say like this is when I should pull it. I don't know. I'm not a very watery individual.
That was kind of my point that I was getting at. So you're a perfect example of somebody where it's like, the push for you, like the point of emphasis for you, of course, conditioning should be at the forefront of anyone that's stepping foot on a stage. But for you, it's like, we want to really keep this fullness and this size. And you're someone that's stage dry. You don't have these estrogenic side effects. You don't carry a lot of water. You're someone that should run it straight into the show. I have no doubt that it adds to the visual of your silhouette. And because of that, there's no reason it should come out. For me, again, like we talked about, I'm kind of in the opposite boat. My best look last year was when we pulled it completely at 2 weeks out, and my test completely at 2 weeks out, actually. And that wound up being the kind of the recipe for my hardest and driest look. Now, there were things that weren't in place then that will be in this upcoming prep for me, so that could be different. I also am going to have a pretty substantial amount more muscle, so who knows what will go into all that. But just typically, if you are working with a client or yourself and you are one of these kind of watery people, and you get that response from drugs, period, you'll know if an elevation in your test gives you that type of like kind of watery, puffy response, you're probably someone that would benefit from keeping it low and then eventually pulling growth hormone entirely leading into a show. I've seen whatever water someone is holding from growth hormone completely clear in like 7 to 10-ish days, anecdotally. That's why I think for me last year, it was like just 2 weeks just to be sure, hey, we're even going into like the start of this peak week with it completely cleared. So, I think those are all good. And then as far as some of like the lipolytics, the fat burners, clenbuterol is a contest prep staple. Where are you at with that? What do you personal experience, coaching experience? Do you like it? Do you use it?
Yeah, I personally love it. I think we should, just kind of graze it, and we'll do a whole podcast on fat burners in general. But
That's a good idea, actually. Yeah, save the content for the people.
Yeah, just because fat burners in general, I mean, we can go a whole hour
We
on. And
should.
then
We should,
maybe
yeah.
there was something I wanted to ask you about because we're talking about pulling growth hormone because of water retention. Where are you
Yeah.
at with the testosterone dose during prep? Are you lowering that at all as prep goes on? Are you pulling it
It
at
should
any
just
point?
hold. It should just
Okay.
hold. Because once we've identified what that see, it depends. Like there's, as I say, that there's scenarios that I can think of where it would make sense to. So, like, okay, let's say I'm coaching Tommy Stiles. Tommy never gets watery. Tommy never needs an AI. Tommy carries a ton of muscle and also gets this estrogen modulating effect from Masteron. We have Masteron in starting at 6 weeks out. And then by 4 weeks out, you just feel completely crash fatigue. Um, Now, assuming that thyroid has already been taken care of exogenously, there's a good chance then that your estrogen would just be too low at that point. So then, yes, I would bring testosterone up so that estrogen follows it and gets back into a healthy range. John's been making this point recently, and I think it makes sense to where you really want to run estrogen as high as you can on prep. So I think there would even be application. Yes, this model that I talked about is always like basically just TRT test and then other compounds. I think there is a case in prep for the right person where you could be bringing testosterone up, and it would make sense. Like you're one of those people. For me, if anything, it's probably coming down.
Yeah, that's more so what I was. Are you lowering it during prep? And are you
Me
even,
personally, so it will for me
or would you with a
it would just
client too?
stay at that. So for me in that scenario where I know like more testosterone is just going to make me more watery and estrogenic, um, no, and then it's probably not going to lower either. It will just at a certain point it will just come out completely. It will be
Mm-hmm.
like what we identified, what I can handle, and then it'll come out. Now that might be different again this year too, like I was saying, because by then I'm going to have gyno surgery, and that has always been kind of the main estrogenic side effect that I get. And then obviously you don't want big inflamed gyno going on stage or gyno at all. So we couldn't risk running my estrogen higher going into the show. Now, once those issues are taken care of and there's not a visual to be worried about, I've never really gotten like anxiety or lost sex drive from high estrogen. It's usually from low estrogen. So this coming prep, it will probably be something where I can run more testosterone than I have in the past. But it, as far as like the thought process, I think it would probably just stay the same for the most part and then come out at all if it needed. But in your scenario, like I said, there might be a case where you would be raising it so that estrogen follows it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could see both. I think if it's a special scenario that I could see is if you had someone that you were trying to make weight with, it may cause you to de-escalate it as you're going down.
Yeah.
Just consideration.
You don't want it to come out completely, but also if there is any kind of excess water floating around, you want to pull it off of this guy or gal before they have to go make weight. I think that totally makes sense too. And
Yeah,
that
I
could be a
mean,
scene where you just pull growth hormone as well.
right. Yeah, I mean that's a consideration. That's why I wanted to touch on test and GH together because if I know everyone we didn't really touch on testosterone esters. Personally, for me, I like enanthate. I don't I don't tell people to use Pro. I don't know if that's bad advice. I don't know. I like enanthate. Cypionate's great in the off season. But
Man, I
they're
just
like
look
a
at
one
it
day difference
honestly.
in half life.
I was gonna say I just look at it like test is test. Like what can you get?
Yeah,
What do you know is on the money dosing wise? Like what
I
can
was
you
just gonna
afford?
say
What can you get your
test
hands
is
on?
test.
Like yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it is. And a lot of the times, like people make this argument you should be switching to short esters, like because then there's the longer esters could be holding more water, whatever. If the difference in your stage look is because of the testosterone ester that you chose for your prep, there were many other things that went wrong before you chose your testosterone ester. that should not and will not be a real limiting factor to you being in shape or dry. Prop, I have heard and seen in some experiences where it just leaves like more swelling and soreness with some people. So I don't even really address, like, it's just whatever people can get their hands on. And then for the most part, I'm having people essentially microdose their gear on a daily basis anyway. So there's no consideration to, oh, this is a longer ester, I only have to inject it so often, or this is prop, I have to inject it every day or every other day. Like, none of that. Like, we just do all the gear microdosed every day. And that's that.
I think there's something, I don't want to butcher this, Scott Stevenson was talking about with Masteron, not needing to run as much testosterone when running it because of it increases free testosterone.
Yeah.
So that's a consideration too. Mainly what I'm getting is your test dose in the off season is probably going to be much higher than what it is in prep.
If that's something that you're in your design that if you're using as like a driver in the off season, I would agree. I think it probably makes sense to bring that back down and kind of let some of these other drugs we're going to use in a prep kind of go to work. It almost feels like sometimes higher testosterone along with these other drugs can almost blur what those drugs are doing because you are holding this additional amount of water. So I'm with you 100%.
Yeah. Just a consideration, something I've learned because, in years back, the test was very high in prep and these compounds were also coming in. So it ended up me using more total milligrams as a light heavyweight than I used last year as a heavyweight. So
yeah. And that was the Frankenstein drug protocol last year.
Yeah. It's something to take into consideration, especially for younger people who are, maybe in their first or second cycle, first or second show, whatever. Like, don't expect contest prep to necessarily be where you throw the kitchen sink at it. If you did everything right, and you worked with it, you gave a coach enough time in the off season and the holding phases, ran proper, had your proper time off where you were cleaning out. Yeah. Contest prep is just another cog in the wheel. So the framework is the biggest thing. I think we touched on a lot of compounds. We touched on the orals we like and use. I'm not a big oral guy. I know there's this thing about Anadrol with loading during peak week. I've never done it, so I can't speak on it.
Yeah, that's another perfect example. I feel like you're someone that I think of where I could come up with a reasoning as to why I would use it with someone like you. And then there are people like me where it would just be an absolute watery disaster if I did it. So that would be a really, really easy way to go from looking like you were stage ready to 8 weeks out for me. If I took some Anadrol at about 3 days out, that would be bad news. So yeah, man, we're at an hour. And like you said, there are some of these other things that we could probably just branch off and do our own episodes on. So I think let's leave it here. I think there's a lot of good stuff to take away from this. Even just talking through it with you, I have some different ideas now. So I think this was really interesting. And then also hearing the perspective from the dry end of the spectrum as opposed to the watery estrogenic end of the spectrum. That I think us being on the two different ends will help people kind of formulate their ideas of how they might toggle back and forth depending on who they're helping or how they respond. So any last minute thoughts that you want to add, or are we good to go?
No, I think we set out and achieved the mission we wanted to do. So talk drugs.
Yeah, everybody's favorite topic. Thanks everybody for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, give us a like, give Tommy Stiles a follow, comment. We're always doing Q&As. It's always part of the rotation. So if you hear this and you're watching on YouTube, drop us a question and we'll eventually get to it. Otherwise, for Tommy Stiles, I'm Joseph PIRCHER. That was a Thinking Man's podcast, and we are out. A Thinking Man's podcast.